What is up, everybody? So we've got another aiming report to go over. We previously looked at Alicia's aiming report that was made, and he was coached by Matty from Voltaic, who I recently did a podcast with. And we also had a couple of days ago the Stico aim report as well. His coaching was done by Minigod, and Minigod was the one that released that report. And now we're going to do Soulcas, who is being coached by Voltaic's Herro. So we've got a VALORANT player once again coming into the fray. And Soulcas is a player that has been a pro in Valorant since the beginning. He was on Team Liquid for a very long time, and then now he's playing with Apeks, and he is somebody that always had a really high ceiling with his mechanics. But I think there was definitely an inconsistency issue that he was facing. And we can see that one of the initial goals here in the introduction is better performance and consistency. And this is also what we saw with Stico's initial goal as well, is just more consistency. And this is really what all pro players will want to aspire toward, because obviously consistency means your performance becomes more predictable. And so that's really good. If you feel like you're out of control of your performance, you're kind of in bad performances when you don't want to be, that's very frustrating and difficult to deal with. And so we have an approach here, or an approach in mind for aiming to have more consistency. And what that effectively means is, if you look at your range of performance as a range, and so there's top to bottom kind of dynamic, then your C game is at the bottom of the range and your A game is at the top of the range. That's one way to think about it. And this is why the ABC game concept is really useful. It can be applied in different ways. But what it allows you to do is identify, okay, here's my bottom 30% of my performance, my C game. What is that exactly? What do I struggle with in terms of my mechanics or decision making, or my kind of mental game? What are all the elements of things that I notice? And once you start to have that awareness to be able to say, this is how I can identify all of the aspects of my C game or my B game or my A game, then you have something very specific to shoot at to improve. And that's how you raise your floor, because that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to get the amount of variance between the bottom of the range and the top of the range. We're trying to kind of push them closer together. So obviously you always want to be increasing your strengths and increasing your ceiling. But ultimately, most players who have consistency issues at the pro level are actually having issues with their skill floor being too low. So the things that they're bad at they're too bad at them, essentially. And this can create more volatility with regards to the player's confidence and so on. So the second objective was smoother and more efficient aim. So as we mentioned above, we aim to provide a more structured approach to our aim and strengthen our weaknesses within this program. So attacking the skill floor, essentially. During the program, we introduced scenarios that are meant to focus on smoothness and stability during different scenarios faced in game. We also went over different concepts such as flicking technique and movement reading to make our aim more efficient. Okay, so adding in some extra stuff that I believe Herro would have spotted in sort of the introductory VODs that would have been sent over by Soulcas. And here's some additional details about what they were focusing on. And so we've got the initial flicks and initial visual processing. And here are the skill categories. Static and dynamic clicking is sort of the aiming mechanics that are happening. And then we've got the aiming at strafing targets. And then the skill categories that are happening here is tracking, multi-click, and dynamic clicking. And then we've got evasive targets. So, whenever enemies are moving in a more evasive ways, maybe diagonally or strafing side to side, who are struggling with stability and smoothness, oftentimes losing control and being unable to eliminate these types of targets. And the categories we have are evasive switching and dynamic clicking. So, okay. So good note, aim trainers allow us to isolate some of these more specific issues with our aim. That's basically what aim trainers, that's like the sales pitch in just one sentence. This is what they really allow you to do, is to isolate. It's a very effective isolation tool. So summary of our program. In this section, we'll go over the identified weaknesses more in depth, talking about relevant aiming concepts and how we utilized aim trainers to successfully target these weaknesses. These include relevant in-game clips. These aren't meant to be lowlights versus highlights, but instead supposed to show the change in aiming technique applied. This is really critical because oftentimes when we look at aim, we think very much about the outcome of, did the person, shoot or kill that person quickly? But if you're an aim coach, or if you're trying to be someone that's kind of coaching yourself, as it were, trying to figure out where your leaks are and how to improve your technique, we're thinking about the technique first and not really the outcome as much, because we want to know if we are improving our habits and working towards that, or if we are just doing the same old thing. So here we can check out these two gifs, and kind of can't speak English. We can kind of sort of establish where we think the leaks might be. And here you've got the initial flick and initial movement reading before. So you've got sort of, so this shot obviously behind this surface is to try to obviously just take advantage of, the person just crouched and stopped moving, so you can kind of know where they are, which I think Soulcas did hit him through the wall there as well. So that's not an error, I would say, at all. I think that's a conscious choice by Soulcas with his movement. So here it's more the case that we just got just a slow adjustment onto the target. We get those initial flick, it's a miss. The adjustment is a miss. We get kind of dodged behind the wall, and that's where it's kind of we're seeing Soulcas kind of use his knowledge of the game here. My opponent is crouched, so they're not going to be able to move really from this position quickly. With my timing, I have the ability to kind of shoot this person knowing that he won't move from this spot, from behind the wall, that is. So let's have a look and see what the other clip looks like. So initial flick and initial movement reading. So initial flick is a lot better. We actually saw a small adjustment there. So it's like a slight overflick, but extremely quick correction from Soulcas there. And then we see patience as well. So overflick on the second opponent. So there's a too much tension here on this following flick. And that happens quite commonly when you've got multiple targets, because when more pressure is on in these scenarios where you know that you have to really fast because the other person is potentially, if they pull their gun out, maybe even gets a timing advantage, you have to be very, very, very fast. And that makes people oftentimes tense up a little bit too much, and then they overflick. That's a symptom of overflicks, is too much tension. However, we've got patience and then good movement reading. So let's look at the notes here. So comparing the before and after, we can spot a clear difference in structure we have for our aim. Our flicking technique was lackluster, and we were having trouble eliminating enemies efficiently when they were further away from our crosshair. Building up the flicking technique. For building up flicking technique, we used the Pokeball in static scenarios, giving us a solid foundation to build upon for more evasive scenarios. So here what you're doing, again, thinking about isolation, is we're isolating the flicking technique, and by using static scenarios, you're removing all movement. You're removing all kind of just messing around with any of those factors. And instead, you're able to more firmly isolate your flicking technique. Because when the opponent is evasive, we're adding in more like reading and reactivity. But when they're static, we can just think about the aiming technique. And that initial flick and correction, that is all, you can figure out your technique with that and train your technique with that with the static scenarios. Then when it comes to, when you're looking to apply this flicking technique, we can see here, the initial flick, the correction, the sort of micro correct onto the second player is we see the overshoot, but we've got, correct technique or a better technique coming into play there. So in the second clip, we're a lot more comfortable having a fast movement to cover the distance from our crosshair to the target, as well as more stopping power to comfortably slow down as necessary. Part of our weakness, and this is a tension thing, stopping power to comfortably slow down as necessary. So when you have like a fast flick, again, as we mentioned, you've got more tension, and then to bring the mouse to a stop, you can stop the mouse with high tension. It's just going to be less consistent. So the slowing down as necessary to me indicates, a better control over the release of the tension, because once you kind of get to that stop, you want just enough tension, the right amount of tension for the stop, and then you want to try and, again, it depends person to person, but I would say for most people, you want to have a lot less tension when you're then doing the micro correction, because it just gives you more control. So the next part of our weakness with the initial flicks also came with the additional pressure felt in game. So we talked about that already. If we feel like we're not able to acquire a target fast enough, we're likely to end up half committing to the flick and firing off empty shots. Yeah, this is an interesting one. This is so one extra point I can mention here as well is we getting into the habit of target reading everything at once, and having that kind of mental plan as to how you go between the targets, and having that kind of focus is really important. we talked about this on the Deco video a little bit, that sometimes what can happen is we'll get into like an over predictive mode on the first target, and if we miss that target, we're just like predicting too hard. We'll end up killing the target eventually, but we don't really have a plan to go quickly enough between target to target, because you have to stay in a very reactive state of mind when you first have that sort of predictive element where you consciously map out the sequence of opponents that you'll shoot, but then you still want to stay sort of like fast and reactive. Essentially, it's kind of hard to explain. I went into it quite a bit yesterday when I released the Deco video, but that can be a difficulty that people have, and why they miss those multi kills, because they're too tunnel visioned on the first opponent. Right. So another important factor is we're not always going to encounter enemies standing still. For enemies that are strafing towards the sides, we incorporated linear dynamic clicking scenarios such as Voltaic dynamic reflex and Amari cartoon reflex flick, where bots are moving horizontally. Whenever the enemies are strafing towards the side, we want to flick very slightly in front of them to be able to catch up properly. If we flick to the exact location we see them in, they're already going to be in a different location after we flick, leaving us in an uncomfortable spot to micro-correct. This can be highlighted in the second clip, where we go very slightly in front of the jet, and we have only to visually confirm he's in our crosshair as he strafes into it. This is a big one. This is a really big one here. So you can look at that again here. Yeah. So when we're doing the, I wonder if we've got any examples of it here for the. No, this is static. Let's just try to find like a dynamic clicking. Okay. So with these types of tasks, what we're trying to do is, and you can see actually that Soulcas is trying to do this here. You want to place your crosshair in front of the target. So we're mixing this sense of reactivity and predictive. So the predictive is us flicking ahead of the target because it's moving. And then what we use is the skill of click timing, so that we react when the orb goes behind the crosshair with clicking. And so that's the synergy between the predictive element and the reactive element. And this is really important, because if you're trying to be, if you just react without kind of trying to, in this case, go a little bit ahead of them, that's not going to work. So you've got to kind of build into your technique that I'm reading the movement, and when I read movement, that's, in this case, I'm going to be flicking ahead of the target and then clicking. And sort of building this into your sort of understanding of how to shoot moving targets is really effective. And as you improve at click timing, you'll find that you'll become quite consistent in these types of engagements. Because if an opponent's moving, it should just always, if let's say, this is a common scenario, I see people with these shots all the time in a more casual setting. When you've got an opponent that's just strafing across the screen, they haven't seen you, they're just going in a straight line. Like, you should never miss those shots. Those are really easy. There's no dodging at all. It's just placing your crosshair in front of them and then clicking when they go behind your crosshair. There are so many moments in tag shooters where this is, you're setting yourself up for shots like that, where you get a really good either off angle, or you get, just you're defending a certain position and you're waiting for them to swing into your crosshair. Like, these are definitely, this is definitely a skill, the click timing, that's critical to be good at tag shooters. So having the sense of like knowing when to use, like, go into this mode is really important. Okay, so cluster shots. So what we're doing here is building up the flicking technique. So let's have a look at this cluster shot 4. Okay, so you can see that we're kind of learning Bard Pill here, where we get the flick and then we are going to get the micro correct, and we're trying to just be accurate. And you can see that there's a lack of, like, the lines aren't super clean. The speed is very slow, because we see that Soulcas is trying to apply the technique and kind of ingrain the technique into his flicks. And this is really important to have this foundational basis of a flicking technique, because then you can build on it over time. If you're flicking, if you don't even know sort of what your flicking technique even is, then it's harder to kind of build on it consistently and to find out where the problems are, because you don't have anything to kind of go off of, right? You don't know what if you can't really explain how your flicking technique works, then if you're having problems improving it, the first place to probably start is to figure out like what your flicking technique is even doing. and is it consistent, is it not, like what's happening? So what we're seeing here is we're getting the barred pill flicking technique, which is a fast flick into a micro correction, and then you react. You do essentially a visual sort of element, which is a hit confirm. Am I over the target? If so, I click. If not, I micro correct again. So that's what we're really learning here, and that's why it looks slow. And so you can see we get, after some sessions, we are building in some speed for the technique. So it definitely looks good. I mean, I don't know if this is slowed down at all, but it definitely still looks a little bit slow. But again, if this is very new, what you want to do is you want to really make sure you enforce the technique first and then build the speed in over time. That's really important, because what tends to happen if you're trying to adopt a new technique, when you build speed too quickly, you just end up getting bad quality reps. The whole point is to get good quality reps so that you're teaching your brain to do something new and to do that new thing as a default. And what that means is you're no longer thinking about this thing anymore. You're no longer thinking about my flicking technique. You then get to think about the next part, maybe the next part of your flicking technique, but not the basis of it. So you get to say, okay, I need to be faster. Okay, now I can just work on being faster. And you can improve your speed much more effectively by doing that. If you want to improve your micro corrections, or, just if you want to dial into any part of that technique, you're now much more free to do so once you actually have in your brain this default built up. But this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to reprogram ourselves, and we can only do that by consistently doing the new behavior. If you don't consistently do the new behavior enough, what tends to happen is eventually or randomly, the old habit will resurface, and you are trying to fight against the old habits to train into new ones so that you have a new normal, as it were. So I just this is like an important point to really hammer home, I think, about training in general. This applies to everything. This is behavior in every sense. If you're someone that doesn't feel like you work hard enough, if you just continue to just act in the same way, that will just be this, the same result. To change that behavior, you may need to figure out what are some kind of tools or kind of little small hacks that will kind of get you to change that behavior to be more productive over time. And then you just keep building on that. But you have to do so intentionally and consciously, because if you don't intervene in that way to forcibly change the behavior patterns, then the same pattern will repeat. It's kind of fractal in that way. So, okay, comparison and breakdown, because I gone off on a tangent. I said I wouldn't do as many tangents on this one, but here we are. I feel like these things are important. So watching both clips, we can see a very clear difference in our flicking technique. Mainly there's a lot less unnecessary motions, and our movements are considerably more precise. It's worth noting that in game example, we were being too smooth with our flicks. This is due to us not being able to have proper technique when speeding up. So this is another great point. It's about the technique and speeding up. This is actually exactly what I mentioned, right? Once you have the basis of the flicking technique, you can begin to understand. Firstly, you get to choose where to apply it in the game, and then secondly, we can say, okay, well, let's speed it up now. Let's speed it up. Let's make it more precise. You can start to do that just by having a basis of technique to work from. By being okay, yeah, I just read that. Right, so we're unable to slow down smoothly onto the target as we acquire it, leading to more jerky movements / micro corrections towards the end. This is a tension management problem. As far as I understand, we'll see if that's what Herro says. We're unable to follow a straight trajectory towards the target, leading us to landing to the sides of it and needing to micro correct in an awkward position after it. So we talked about the not having the clean lines. Our initial flicks aren't precise enough, often requiring a micro correction onto the target. Oh, by the way, one of the reasons why these, you'll sort of see a lack of clean lines, especially on, I would say, more so the vertical movements. We're not really seeing that be an issue on the horizontal movements as much. It's more the vertical movements. The reason is I would say because typically when you're a tactical FPS player, you're not you don't get many reps flicking up and down. You're I would say, by default, just because of the amount of reps, you're very confident and clean on the horizontals, but the vertical aiming is not going to be as clean because you just don't have the same amount of reps on that. So it's a normal thing for a tactical shooter player. Okay. After working on initial flick technique and focusing on being able to land our flicks accurately, we're able to speed up and slow down as necessary. Our transitions from a fast initial movement onto the target as we acquire it are smooth, leading us to complete the movement with a microcorrection instead of having to almost have two separate motions. We follow a straight trajectory towards the target, ensuring our microcorrection is at a more comfortable angle, and as said before, complete the movement with a microcorrection when necessary. We're also able to land directly on the target more often with more precise initial flicks. Okay, so these are all improvements. Straight trajectory, so that means less microcorrection, and generally, the movement's going to feel more efficient. Land directly on the target. Obviously, that's ideal, especially in an attack shooter where you've precisions everything. Note, VODs of this scenario were taken as benchmarks as we included it early in our program and reintroduced it later. Well, so we talked about this with Steco's one yesterday too, where many specifically left sort of some tasks as, hey, we'll play this now and then we're going to play this later, but you're not going to get any practice on this, so that we can tell if you improved from your raw kind of aiming mechanics, so that we can kind of take out of that kind of the factor of practice. Because if you play a task a lot, you'll improve just because you've practiced it a lot. This scenario is added as a technique builder for our flicks by having a TAF type scenario. We're practicing reacting to a target appearing on the screen and also forcing us into awkward angles. These types of scenarios also help us push our flick speed. And I can zoom this in a little bit. Oh, oops. It's a bit too much of a zoom. There we go. That's a bit better. These types of scenarios also help us push our flick speed by having the targets despawn after a while. After we got comfortable with micro TAF hard, we implemented VT micro TAF harder to push our speed further. This task is played the following way: aim towards the red target and stay on it until the black one spawns. Once it spawns, eliminate the red target, then flick towards the black target and eliminate it as well. Reset back to the new red target and repeat the process. Our approach to this task was heavily focused on initial flick accuracy. Our goal was to always be able to comfortably land on the black target and executing complete movements regardless of the time pressure. This gets us in the habit of speeding up instead of going for incomplete movements when we're under pressure to eliminate a target. Right. Short distance flick. Okay. We've got cartoon reflex flick. Let's go to the technique here. Okay, so again, you want to be aiming ahead of the target with these as much as possible. The perfect thing would be for your crosshair to land just slightly ahead of the target. So you can see that Soulcas is certainly trying to train that click timing element where you can see he's like sometimes leaving the crosshair on the inside when the target goes towards the very kind of far left or right of the range, because you know that it's going to bounce and come back into your crosshair. So leaving it on the inside in those spots where it looks like it's trailing is fine. But generally speaking, the perfect version of this is where the crosshair would be just slightly ahead of the target on each flick. And once you get really practice with these tasks, you get really good at doing that. And then it's really the case of kind of how quickly can you kind of speed up and keep reacting with your kind of hit confirms, because that's what I usually find is that can be the issue, is how fast your hit confirms can be, because it's not super hard to flick to these targets, but it's definitely good practice for click timing and precision. Good initial movement reading is key to be able to catch up to targets effectively, as mentioned above. If we flick directly to where the target is and it's moving, we'll lag behind and have a harder time eliminating it. So we just talked about that. In this scenario, we're heavily focused on flicking very slightly in front of the target and using our click timing skills to eliminate it as it strafes into our crosshair. Our approach for this task was to focus on visually interpreting a target's location and movement direction before trying to catch up to it. This helped us develop our initial movement reading and get into the habit of taking a target's movement into account as we're flicking toward it. Note, there are cases where the target will change directions or is moving evasively. This is covered in detail in some of the next blocks. This scenario was added to isolate this skill without having to worry about what the target does after our initial flick. This skill can be observed in our Amari dynamic micros clip shown later in this document. So this is definitely something that I'll probably do a video on. It's just how isolation can be used in your training, because again, aim trainers are the best tool for isolating aim. because you can just pick a tiny kind of technique or mechanic or something, and you remove all the noise, and you just get to practice that one thing to really clean up your technique. So that really is the strength of aim trainers. But there is and I think some of Matty's Unraveling the Secrets of Aim video really showed this really nicely. In particular, I think the one with Skooky, which is where I noticed it, where you could see a very, very high level aimer, how he sort of sequentially went through all like many different types of tasks that were specifically to isolate like small parts of an overall technique that he then later uses in the video. And it was quite enlightening to see how he approached the training there. So I'll definitely do a video on that. But here we go. Let's move further down. So Valorant example of our improved initial movement reading. So let's have a look at this. Okay, so we've got the cipher on link. We've got a flick. The flick goes, it's a slight over flick, but it works. But it works. Evasive targets and stability. Okay, so we've got 4 targets on screen here. Moving all over the place. Yeah, so this is a very common scenario for people to struggle with, because you've got 4 targets that aren't, you have no idea how to predict their movement because they're just all doing just different things. One is looking at you, 3 are not. Any of them could turn at any moment. So, and it sucks because you go for this peak. When you're sort of planning in your head to stop your swing, you don't know necessarily how many players you're going to be facing at that point. This is a very deep swing. So I'm sure that it was a case that Soulcas heard that there were lots of players and he just wants to try to engage and fight to the death, because this is an aggressive swing to take when you hear all those footsteps. But with that said, it's still hard to hit all these players and obviously get a multi-kill in that scenario. And in the clip above, we have a couple of things that go wrong. However, what I'd like to highlight is the lack of smoothness and stability present when acquiring more evasive targets. So let's look at that. Yeah, it definitely didn't look clean, that's for sure, or as clean as you would like it to look. We're unable to slow down our initial movement in time, resulting in an overflick and a jerky motion trying to get back onto the target. True. Ironing out smoothness and stability. The more evasive a target is, the smoother we have to be toward the ending of our initial flicks. This will help us to read their movement properly and not make them seem more evasive than they already are. We can relate this to our smoother flicking technique featured in a cluster shot VOD above. This is the reason we implemented evasive switching scenarios to practice smoothness at the ending of our flicks, as well as the initial smooth acquisition of the target after it. So this is some similar stuff, I would say, as to what we had with the issue with Steeko's, some of Steeko's issues, where we looked at the idea of kind of the being too predictive and not reactive enough with the aiming. And in this scenario that we're sort of looking at the moment, we're thinking about having, let's say, more control at the end of the essentially in these corrections, having more control, so maybe a bit less tension. And we're also looking to not predict what the opponents are doing, because we can't. This is a scenario where you can't really predict where they're going to go. So you want to be very reactive with this. And so obviously with all these opponents on screen, you get more tense, generally speaking. And it's oftentimes what causes people to miss shots in those scenarios. So we're looking for that smoothness at the ending of the flicks, as well as a smooth acquisition of a target. So we've got a slightly harder switching or dynamic clicking scenario here, where again we're trying to do this similar thing where you kind of are forced to track them a little bit because they're moving pretty quickly, and you want to be sure that you hit the target. So we're getting a little bit of tracking going on here, which is good actually, because the target is moving unpredictably left to the right and a little bit up and down as well. So you're having to really exert a lot of control, like smoothness. I think that slight up and down change in direction is really helpful for helping you to kind of be forced into that smoothness, because you need to be able to obviously have the control to be able to add that extra plane of movement in, other than just the horizontal movement that you typically would have in attack shooter. So I like that a lot for this task. You're still seeing that you're trying to flick ahead of the target, But again, because they're moving so quickly, it's you can quite easily, if you miss the click timing essentially. So we're getting, good reactive training. And one thing I'll note here as well is that you typically don't aim like this when you're shooting in Valorant. Like, you don't tend to just track the opponent and then try to click once in this way. So, but what this is actually doing by sort of training something that you don't otherwise really train in Valorant is improving your ability to react. Because if, let's say, you are off at all with your initial flick, once you've acquired the target, you're able to kind of have that smoothness. So you can kind of, especially if you want to be tapping, you have that smoothness to be able to follow the target easily and make your micro corrections, or be free to make your micro corrections and free to just practice reading the target movement in a reactive fashion, and don't read the target movement in more of a predictive fashion. And that's why I think this is particularly good, because you have that prediction because you see the initial movement. So because you need to have that prediction, because you're doing a flick. And if you do an instant flick in that moment, when you have the information of the direction of the target, you have to make that prediction. That's a prediction. And so you have to flick at that moment. However, the target could change what it's doing. So you have to be able to react to that change. And so that's where, we want to kind of have this sense of where is our predictiveness in our shot? Where is the reactiveness in our shot? Do we have the right techniques to be reactive? Do we have the right techniques to follow up on the prediction? So in that sense, the initial flick is the predictive shot, because we see where the target's moving. And then after we get to the target, it could change its mind. So then we have to be reactive. So you need the skills for both of those aspects. And so we're training that smoothness and that tracking in this particular instance. And we're training the reactivity, because to be able to consistently track the target, we have to react correctly. So it actually looks really good here from Stico. So I think I don't know if I over explain that, but I think it's always interesting to really, I think, try to break these things down as much as we can. In this type of scenario, we're mostly focused on the switching aspect and not necessarily the tracking. As long as we're able to stay smooth at the end of our flicks and during the target acquisition, we'll be able to eliminate targets efficiently. So yeah, I can add another thing here for sure. Just this is a great point that Herro mentions, that with these targets, you are definitely forced into that smoothness. And again, when you come off of a flick, you have more tension, and to get that smoothness really dialed in and that fluidity in the movement, you need to kind of reduce some of the tension to be able to aim well there. Again, I can't really emphasize this enough. A lot of mistakes in aiming comes from having too much tension. Not like, if you do a big flick, you've got a lot of tension, and if you don't turn that tension down at all, then you have less control on the after you land the initial flick. And so that's what we're really talking about here in terms of creating that stability and getting that smoothness after that initial flick. Okay, so predictive movement reading before. So yeah, you can see kind of like trying to oh, it's awkward. It feels so close. Like, this feels like just so close, but the Omen is just like shimmying in the just the perfect way to dodge every bullet. That's so sad. So these are the befores, predictive movement reading, and then we've got the control strafes. Okay, so that we talked about this with the Stico one too, because we also had for similar reasons this type of task. So taking a look at both clips, we can notice a clear weakness. We're having trouble getting back onto the smooth target smoothly after it changes directions. This is due to two things: trying to preemptively aim in front of the target and trying to get it to come into our crosshair when it continues to strafe. So this movement prediction. So lack of control and smoothness when reacting to directional changes. So again, the way I like to describe this, and I went in kind of depth in a tangent yesterday. I say yesterday because that's when I dropped the Stico analysis video. But yeah, there's these two. There's this. This is my favorite way to think about this right now. I just sort of like came up with this the other day, but just the opposite of predictive aiming is reactive aiming. And there's like different parts of your brain are essentially, and this is again just from my anecdotal personal experience of these things. Different parts of your brain, I'm not a neuroscientist, are going to be utilized in these two things, and you want to make sure that the right part of your mind is doing the right thing. at the right time. And what can happen oftentimes is when we get too predictive, we reduce our ability to be reactive. You can think of it like this scale. If you're too far in the predictive place, you're not going to be able to react quickly to changes in direction here. So what tends to happen is you're trying to predict too hard, so you keep just missing and you can't glue to the target. If you just sort of shut off that part of your brain that's doing this sort of like movement prediction where you're trying to jump ahead of the target and you just react instead, that's when you get really insane reactivity or really insane smoothness, because again, you're like kind of shutting off this like predictive part. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to create a new habit for our technique. And so what we need to do is we need to feel the difference. So feel the difference of the really, the predictive aspect, like being really predictive. And if you're starting out in that way, then just understand how that feels versus like almost going, the kind of glazy eyes, like super soft focus where you're just reacting. You're kind of experiencing the target in a completely different way. So that's that, isolating that kind of feeling and then starting to kind of get good at these tasks can really help in game, because again, it's often an undertrained aspect of aiming is how to be really good reactively. And part of the reason can be due to many different factors. Just the very element of having pressure forces you more into this conscious brain. This actually comes much more into a lot of the sports psychology stuff that I talk about, because when you have an environment where there is pressure, the pressure is something that is perceived mentally, psychologically by you. And that pressure creates physiological responses, more adrenaline and noradrenaline, more cortisol in your system. You start to, tense up. And what can happen quite easily is if you get distracted, you focus too much on that distraction because your brain is like, I'm under attack. My limbic system is activated. I'm under attack. I'm in fight or flight mode. That can easily happen. Things can easily ramp up into that place. And then you become hyper focused on, your focus is not essentially in the right places. You're too distracted. And so what is happening there is you're kind of being drawn into that conscious part of your brain. Like imagine any time you've had a poor performance, as soon as you get in your own head, everyone's experienced this. That's what getting in your own head means. It means that your focus is not on what it should be on. You can't, for some reason, your ability to focus is hindered. And instead you're thinking about things that do not matter. Things, thoughts are creeping into your mind of, oh, this sucks, or, I'm like playing so bad, or, it can be any of these negative things. When you're at your peak performance, you're completely focused on the task at hand. If you've ever been in your flow state, you'll know this feeling when everything else kind of just vanishes and all you're doing is almost like predicting the future. And you have this insanely powerful predictive accuracy, and you also have this insanely powerful reactiveness too. So you have amazing predictions, but you never get caught up too much in your predictions to lose any of the like reactivity. So the immediate second, just instantly as information changes, you react to it with excellent prediction and you're still reactive. So if things change again, you're still going to adapt very quickly. If you find yourself stuck in more predictive sort of places, you can get really caught up in just a slow kind of, you can't react as quickly because you're in this kind of slow part of your brain. And this was described by Daniel Kahneman, who sadly recently passed away, in his book Thinking Fast and Slow, where he describes the way that we think as these two systems. He called it System 1 and System 2. And the way I always looked at it with regards to esports was quite similar, because I noticed this duality between the conscious aspect of what your brain is doing. I'm communicating, I'm thinking, I'm making predictions in real time, where it's more of this slower brain. And then there's this whole like level where you do stuff sometimes that you cannot explain. You have feelings that you've got this perfect timing, but there's no way that you could explain that, because it is your brain, the part of your brain, like one part of your brain, I think it's the system 2, as Daniel Kahneman would describe, is super high bandwidth. So it's receiving all this information really rapidly, stuff that you can't actually comprehend, because it's understanding all these patterns, it's modeling everything based on past experiences. All these things are going on because the game is like pretty complex and there's all these different things that could happen, but you just know what the right thing is to do. And you can't understand how you got to that. What was the calculation? You have no idea. All you know is the outcome, and the outcome is a feeling. And so this is really that kind of system 2. And so we're constantly trying to have this perfect balance of the sort of more kind of, conscious system one brain and what that's supposed to be executing, and then also we want to have that really, perfect balance with that system two element of thinking as well, because if both things are operating at full capacity synergistically, that's when you're in your flow state. And so it's often this kind of, battle back and forth between kind of creating that balance. And so if you get into a spot where you're way too predictive, that's when you slow down in your thinking and you can't keep up with the game, because you can't. So you can't get too tunnel visioned, which naturally happens as a result of like really like high cortisol levels and adrenaline. Like your brain tunnel visions on stuff, and it can kind of shut down some of those intuition systems. So you got to be really cautious of what's happening there, to get to your best performances. So I hope that was like a decent explanation of some of those concepts and sort of like what to me this all relates to. Let's move forward, because dude, am I gonna make this video even longer than the last one? Bloody hell. Okay, so next topic we go to is eliminating the unnecessary movements on strafing enemies. So as detailed above, one of the key parts of readjusting / aiming at strafing targets is being able to read their movements. So that is definitely an important aspect. And one benefit the tracking scenarios offers us is being able to isolate movement reading and micro corrections back onto a target once it changes directions. Okay. So we've seen some of the weaknesses, and what they're doing, what Herro is doing to target those weaknesses with Soulcas. And we can see here, it just like randomly stops, which is kind of nice. And so you just got to feel it. You got to feel it. Again, like this is why the aim lab can be really nice, or the aim trainers, because you just get this isolation, man. This is just very pure. Like what's happening right now is just okay. You just got to feel the changes in direction, and try not to overreact. Because if you start over flicking, then is that you sort of that's you predicting what's going to happen next. Are you predicting what's going to happen next because of the movement that just happened, or are you predicting it because that's what you think is going to happen? Because one of those is okay and one's not. Like we see, for example, a slight kind of continued movement before the target stops, but that's because that's the direction the target was previously moving. So that doesn't really seem like prediction. I'm over predicting. It seems kind of like, okay, I'm reacting a little bit too slow. And so that's something else that you can also train with these tasks, is you can train to be faster in your reactions just by doing these tasks a lot. Because it's like a muscle, you're practicing, helping that part of your brain get better at this type of shooting. And what happens, and again, this is something that I've experienced a lot when I was training, when I was like a young Quake player. What I would do is, if I had trouble with certain movements, I would isolate them, and I would find a way to isolate them for flicks or whatever it is, like long range flicks. I try to isolate micro corrections. And over time, what I would do is, I would often do stuff like I would play one kind of just aim. It's like equivalent of DM. Just I would do that like for 2 weeks straight, just working on micro corrections, or just working on the couple focuses I had with my aim. And what would happen is I would get a feeling, and I noticed this. I was like, oh, I feel what it's like to train this technique. I feel what this technique is like. So I can instead have now a developed sense of what that feeling is like, and then I can continue to hone that and can continue to tap into that when now I'm actually in the live playing environment, because I've adjusted how I do this thing, and it's a feeling. It feels different. I'm sure, like, it's hard to explain this, but I'm sure that a lot of you that have been through your own training will understand that you're trying to develop a feeling. And so I explained this a little bit yesterday by using the analogy of throwing a ball. When you're throwing a ball, your brain is doing trigonometry to calculate the trajectory and the force that's required to get the ball to go into the bucket you're trying to throw it into. And you, as the person, you can improve your technique over time by just throwing the ball. But how does your brain learn how to improve that at that? We don't really know necessarily. We can't really talk about that. We don't really understand what's happening under the hood. But what we do get is we get a feeling. Oh, this is like, I'm like looking at the bucket, and I throw the ball, and I get kind of like a feeling it's going to go in. I get a feeling that this is the right amount of force, and this is the right kind of like trajectory. we have no idea about the trigonometry that's happening, but we get a feeling. And over time, as we improve our technique, we work on our technique, we really are tapping into that feeling as much as possible. Over time, we are able to improve it more quickly, and we're able to be more consistent with it. So I just want to emphasize that, because again, when we're talking about intentional training, we want to try to understand what we're doing, and we want to try to understand, what the purpose is and what our focus should be on when we're doing, anything really, ideally. Obviously, some mindless grind is a thing, but I would say that that's more overrepresented than underrepresented. So I'm going to represent more of the the intentional training. So a key tool we applied during the program was auxiliary scenarios, where we isolated a weakness with something very specific and focus on applying it in the following scenario. This is one of those cases where the focusing on the correct execution during track stop helped us isolate direction changes specifically and allowed us to get the most out of control strafes. This scenario was inspired by the Kovacs version of itself. The scenario is unique because instead of having a direction change, it has stops. These stops will help us to react to enemy stopping. Our unnecessary movements also come from a prediction that the target will end up somewhere after it changes directions. Since the bot stands still, we're able to microcorrect onto it in a more controlled manner and gain the habit of being smooth and precise when microcorrecting. These skills helped us improve our aiming technique, both in aim lab and in game. So this is the after. So this is way better. I mean, this is slowed down. This definitely looks slowed down for sure, and this looks way better. And it's slowed down so you can kind of see where the crosshair is being placed, of course, or be able to have a better look at it. And you can see that there is not really the predicting we talked about before here. Now we're actually just seeing a lot more reacting, and this is great. And the only issue here is the smoothness a little bit. But that's okay. Like, it's not a big deal, because once we get the micro correction on like a little micro correction flick, because we're seeing these little flicks, we're getting decent smoothness. So it actually looks way cleaner than these previous looks. So big improvement there. We can spot a clear distinction in the way we react to directional changes. We're a lot more in control and can get back onto target more comfortably as compared to the first clip. Note how much slower the bot's movements look in this clip. Avoid losses of control, and sticking to smooth and precise movements makes it easier to read the target's movements. While scores aren't everything, we were able to spot improvements after analyzing recent runs compared to the old ones. Nice. I mean, the scores are a good indication for sure. Nice. Beautiful. Active movement reading after. Actually, you know what? I wonder... I'm going to see if I can find something really quick, because let's have a look. I just want to see if I can find something real quick. Because actually, you know what? I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to do it. I'll just speak it into existence instead. What I was going to say is that for those of you that know sort of like what a muscle up is, a muscle up is when you have a bar or gymnastic rings or whatever, and you're hanging, and you kind of pull yourself up over and push yourself over the bar. So you do a pull up, and then you kind of get into a spot where the bar is kind of like against your armpits, and you are able to kind of then do a dip essentially. So in the CrossFit world, what they do is they use momentum to do almost the entirety of the movement. So it's explosive, and they basically go from the bottom right to the top position with no control really in between those 2 points. And the philosophy with gymnastics and gymnastic training, for a variety of reasons, is that you want to have strength through every part of the range of motion. So when you see a gymnast doing a muscle up instead, every single sort of like part of the movement, they're going to have control over it. So they'll be able to do the entire movement like extremely slow, and it will look just completely smooth through every part of the movement. And the reason why I think that philosophy is pretty awesome and can be applied to many different things, and we can look at it with aim training right here. If you are able to isolate and have a strength and control at any point of the movement, it gives you the most flexibility and consistency when you're actually trying to perform. because when you're actually trying to perform, things are not going to go as planned. So for you to have the fullest amount of control, because you are strong no matter where you find yourself in the particular movement or series of movements, then you're going to be in a place where you're going to have the most success. And so with regards to, how do you train to achieve this? There are certain, areas where you might notice in the movement where you're weaker over time. If you're just the CrossFitter in this example, and you just use kind of power and momentum, and you get from the bottom position to the top position, you don't know on those in-between parts where your weaknesses are, because you have no data at all. You're just going from the bottom to the top with momentum, and that momentum hides any of the weaknesses. So another thing that comes to my mind sometimes when I think about how you train movements, or in general, that you would want to ideally be able to be strong in every part of the range, because that's where the true strength will be, the true control will be, and the longevity and consistency will be. And also, like, you won't injure yourself. Be way less likely to injure yourself. Okay, so active movement reading afterwards. So we've got the first target there, a slight straight from that guy. On the KO, we got a nice adjustment as well. Yeah, pretty nice. We also get we get some little strafes coming through as well from Soulcas between each of these movements. This is really key. A lot of people will press the crouch key when they start to be unsure, but because of the level of control here, we're able to get a couple taps. We get it. We were actually going for a couple taps on that second guy, but you can see that Soulcas kind of surprise kills him on the first shot there. So, and the reason why I understand that is because we see the second shot get whiffed. So Soulcas hasn't even registered that he's killed that guy, and he's shooting the next bullet already, the second one. So we do a tap tap move, tap tap move, tap tap move. Well, actually, there's a third one there until he gets the kill, and then finally finishes off his last opponent, but also continues to move. This is something that I'm going to make another video on this as well, but just in Valorant, it's really important to have full control of your movement and your gunfights, and to maximize your utilization of it as consistently as you can. And we see this is a great example of that, because Soulcas is constantly moving between the kills, between the 2-3 bullets. Even if he doesn't get the kill, or if he does get the kill, he's just moving regardless. And this is a very good habit to have. Okay, so what we want to highlight in this clip is not necessarily the 4K, but the second and third kills. After we flick towards the aim, we're able to see he's strafing towards the right side and react to him stopping appropriately. The same goes for the KO, although we did shoot a bit too early. Oh my god. Oh my god, there's so much more to go. Although we did shoot a bit early, we're not predicting. He's changing directions, and instead we react to it. Yes, yeah, you can clearly see that. There's that like small break where it's a reaction instead of a prediction. That's beautiful. So tracking to approach the micros. Okay, so tracking approach to micros. Right, of course. Okay, so we talked about this earlier, and this is essential for good pistol or consistent pistol aim, because of the way that you shoot pistols and how fast targets move and how wide their strafes can be. Being able to track the opponents, like we saw in some of the previous aim lab tasks, is really nice when you're kind of doing the single clicks, so looking for the headshots. So that's an example of that type of situation. Similar example where you're kind of, you're trying to track your opponent and you're just trying to tap to get that headshot. And at long ranges, that makes sense, because you don't want to be spraying at long ranges. It's going to be pretty inconsistent. Okay, comparing this clip to the one featured in the previous section, we can see clear improvement of our movement reading. We swapped out our predictive approach to aiming at strafing enemies from a more active movement reading. However, we still have trouble aiming at some of the strafing targets by trying to track them continuously and clicking at arbitrary intervals and hoping we're on target in that specific moment. I feel like this describes all of us. Micro corrections and tracking versus click timing. Since in Valorant we're using mainly a tapping/bursting style, avoiding relying on recoil due to its randomness and inconsistency, we can treat it similarly to semi-automatic weapons. Our approach to shooting strafing enemies should always be keeping our crosshair close to them. Then once the recoil is reset or ready to take another shot, micro correct and visually confirm and click in one smooth motion. Okay, so micro correct, visually confirm, and click in one smooth motion. So this visual confirmation aspect, this is something that, again, the aim trainers are really good at doing, because especially as you get better and better at them, you're going to be, playing harder and harder scenarios where targets are small, they're moving quickly, and like these visual confirmations are really hard to do effectively. And so if you get good at doing it in a harder environment and you go back to Valorant where targets move slower, they're a bit bigger, it's actually going to feel like it's going to feel like right now, if you've never really tried to train any of this stuff will feel quite difficult. But once you have trained it and you then kind of go back into the game with it, it kind of changes your level of patience. If you look at how Demon One aims, he is amazing at his visual confirms. Like he will move his crosshair really fast, but you'll notice that he often will kind of have a slight pause because he's doing a confirmation, so he absolutely guarantees the shot, and he's very good at that. So our visual confirmation should be very brief, and is one of the key skills we worked on inside AimLab. Yep. Micro correcting and clicking and being able to tell we're on target at one specific moment will always outperform trying to continuously track without paying attention to when we're clicking. So this is this idea of let's not be random, let's just always confirm. Sometimes obviously you're going to have to go really fast and you might not have time, but as we improve, we'll get good at being faster ourselves and reacting more quickly. So with that said, we're still utilizing tracking and switching scenarios with our training to work on movement speed, reading, micro-correcting, and directional changes as well. Okay, so Amari dynamic before, micros before. So again, we're seeing very similar trends here. You want to flick ahead of the target, it's click timing. You want to have after the initial flick, you want the first flick to be fast, you want the follow-up to be kind of smooth and controlled because you kind of relieved some of that arm tension after the initial flick. And yeah, this is the before, so it's not looking super awesome. In the short clip, we can spot our tracking approach to shooting at moving targets. Instead of going for a smooth micro and click motion, we're trying to track them and clicking it right. By the way, just Soulcas has very good aim. Soulcas has really, really good aim. And so I just think it, just taking a second to reflect on the fact that we're looking at these aim reports for pros, and there is so much improvement. There's so many edges to be gained. I think is really interesting. And it's something that I already knew from having kind of been in the scene for a while now, but it's really cool to have these reports to really see what the process is like with the pros. Because it makes them look not amazing, because that's the whole point, is that we're trying to find their weaknesses and their leaks. And so yeah, it's really interesting. Okay, so evasive targets versus linear targets. In previous sections, we already covered our initial flick and basic aiming technique. For these types of targets, we want to have more stability and smoothness at the ending of our flicks compared to static and linear targets. The main distinction between these two types of targets is the follow-up to our initial flick / the catch-up movement. And this contrast can be seen very clearly with some of the in-game and AimLab examples above of more linear targets, where it was a fast initial movement to catch up and using our click timing skills to eliminate targets. After we finish our initial movement, we are always wanting to follow it up with either one of two cases, paying very close attention to what the targets are doing. Okay, so the target followed the same trajectory and we landed in the correct spot. Here we have to use our click timing skills to eliminate it. Okay. This is the best case and the one where we're usually the most successful. It's always the case in AimLab tasks where we're isolating the specific issue of falling behind targets, such as Amari cartoon reflex flick, showcased in the previous section. And the second thing is we landed in the correct spot smoothly, but the target changed directions, or our initial flick did not land in the correct spot. In this case, we have to micro correct. Our micro corrections should always be done in one smooth motion. Micro correct, flick, click. We should avoid tracking these targets and instead focus on being able to execute these micros properly once we're close enough to the target. The reason for this is we're not practicing continuously being on the target and instead being able to get on target for one specific moment where we click our mouse. So we're talking about avoiding tracking as opposed to going for just tracking the opponent basically. Right. So this is an interesting distinction because you in theory, you could track the target, but we're looking to not do that because presumably, this gives you more control and it makes it more obvious when you're trying to attempt your shot, because you attempt your shot on the micro and you're being reactive. Whereas with the tracking, you can stay in that more reactive mode, but it seems like we're going for the flick, and perhaps due to consistency. I'm not sure entirely why we've made that choice. It would be interested if you guys understand in the comments below, but I could see why you would want to, if you're picking between these two habits, why you'd want to do a micro correct instead. Okay, so Amari dynamic micros after. So we're aiming above the target. That's slight underflick on that one, which is always preferable. The underflicking can be a technique choice. Okay, so I mean, these are looking pretty good technique-wise. It's looking really nice. We had the underflick with a nice micro correct. We're not getting the tracking, which is good. This is the decision that's been made for our technique, and we're getting in front of the targets for the most part. We've got a good micro. We've got good, that good basis of flicking technique with the barred pill, flick, micro correct, hit confirm. We're looking generally smoother. Some of the lines, the vertical lines, as we discussed before, still a little bit suboptimal in the cases, but honestly, it's massively improved, I would say, still. And we're a little bit less jerky in general, so there's more smoothness. So overall, a lot of improvements in this clip. We can see improvements in our execution of our macros, including instances of both cases where we have to follow up our initial flick. Whenever we're able to get slightly in front of the target and it follows the same trajectory, we use our click timing skills to eliminate them. Whenever the target changes direction or we're unable to catch up properly with our initial flick, we micro correct onto it and click it in one smooth motion. So Mini's HS headshot strafe click before. So lots of like predicting there and just coming off the target. In this clip, we can see our initial approach. We can take a look at the accuracy shifting to see the empty shots we're firing when we're not on target. These spam clicks without any sort of visual confirmation should be avoided. And we want to be focusing on clicking in the one specific moment in time when we're on target. That's the skill we're looking for. So it's looking a little bit better. So look at the notes. Here we can see our corrected approach where we're staying as close to the target most of the time without necessarily trying to stay on it the whole time and doing micro corrections and clicks for every shot. Okay, so that's cool. So yeah, we're really looking to try, like the accuracy is important here because you're trying to avoid spam clicking. That's what we're trying to avoid. This is one of those targets that doesn't die in one click, it dies in multiple clicks. So, and you can see that purposely like letting the target go a little bit because we're not obsessed with staying on the target because we want to practice the micro correct after the movement. So I like that isolation a lot. That's really cool, actually. We haven't seen that before, I don't think, in the previous reports. So click timing approach afterwards. Okay, you can see a nice click here. Okay, way better. What's really nice here is that you can see we're actually getting on top of the constant movement, we're getting micro corrects, which is actually really nice. This is something that's not super easy to execute for most people because as you're moving, again, like most players and tac shooters are going to be used to aiming whilst they are stationary because that's when you're accurate. So having the sort of mechanic of I'm going to be, ADing, taking a couple shots and then moving. And then also having the micro correct as you're in movement is an extra element of challenge. But this looks really good. Even though this might not be the most insane clip and we missed some shots, this is a good clip to showcase click timing versus tracking approach. We can see how for every shot with the we fire, there's a micro correction and a click at the end of it, taking advantage of the downtime we get when strafing during a gunfight to get closer to the target. I've never had anyone put it this way, actually, but this is really awesome. Taking advantage of the downtime we get when strafing during a gunfight. Ooh, I like that a lot. That's brilliant, actually. Okay, before and after conclusion. Well, I've made this one a bit longer than the last one. So the goals we set for the 8-week training program were as follows: reacting properly to targets further away from the crosshair, actively movement reading instead of predictions, micro correcting and not tracking, eliminating evasive targets efficiently. So throughout the program, we've been through some ups and downs because of scheduling issues. It became difficult to sometimes keep track of progress in certain areas and work on the continuity of the program. However, we've seen improvements in different key areas detailed above. We definitely adopted a more structured and efficient approach to our aim, enabling us to perform more consistently in game. throughout the program, we also learn the techniques and aiming principles, making us more self-sufficient. This is definitely an important theme that we see with all the Get Amped programs, is how they've tried to create self-sufficiency, which is really important, because these programs are I think 4 to 8 weeks depending. I think it's usually for 8 weeks. And a very important note to add, one of the issues mentioned in the document is the loss of control. These usually occur on more evasive targets, but happen also whenever more precise movements are needed. These losses of control have been targeted by implementing scenarios similar to the in-game situations. However, they still happen occasionally. Soulcas has mentioned feeling comfortable using smoothness scenarios in Kovacs on higher sense to target these before writing some smoothness scenario recommendations at the end of the document to play, in addition to our AimLab playlist. Yeah, these smoothness scenarios really come in clutch, I think, for tag FPS players, because you just don't get any reps on this when you're playing the actual game. So having that as an additional technique to go to can be really, really beneficial in creating more stability and just overall having a higher skill floor. So you've got here at the end as well the tasks and the playlist that he used for these issues. That was it's a program created by Herro. So you guys can also find this link and click on it as well. Right. Okay. I think that brings us to the end of this one. Another really interesting program that was released by Herro this time from Voltaic. It's really cool that they're releasing these. Let me know what you think of just my approach to these, because I presume there's going to be more of these in the future from more of the coaches. So if you think that the sort of more tangential kind of format is better, where we're just kind of going through it on sort of first react, for me, just bringing up these points and concepts that come into play as I notice them. If you like that, let me know. If you think I should do it in a different way, happy to check out what you guys think and sort of adjust as I get the feedback. All right, thank you for watching, and I'll catch you on the next one.